All righty. Good evening and welcome. My name is Carrie McWilliams, and I'm the Executive Director of the Gap Year Association and the moderator of this evening's panel titled The Year of Purpose, Exploring the Gap Year Option. On behalf of the Gap Year Association, as well as tonight's sponsor, College Confidential, thank you for joining us. Every February, the Gap Year community comes together to connect and amplify the growing Gap Year movement through Gap Year Exploration Month. We are thrilled that this evening we have a distinguished panel of experts joining us in recognition and celebration of this year's Gap Year Exploration Month. Before introducing this evening's panelists, I'd like to provide you with an introduction to both the Gap Year Association and our sponsor, College Confidential, as well as provide you with an overview of the format of this evening's webinar. So first, the Gap Year Association is the only national nonprofit working to coordinate the growing Gap Year movement. The Gap Years Association is recognized by the U.S. Department of Justice and the U.S. Federal Trade Commission as the Standards Development Organization for Gap Year Education and oversees a robust accreditation process for Gap Year providers and consultants. Our mission is to maximize the potential of young adults through accessible and meaningful Gap Year opportunities. Helping us with that effort this evening is our sponsor, College Confidential, a college admissions website and online community which hosts popular forums on topics such as admissions, financial aid, standardized testing, and school life. You'll notice that tonight's webinar is hosted in a format in which only the panelists' video and audio will be accessible. As audience members, your video and audio are disabled, not because we don't want to hear from or see from you, but simply because we had overwhelming interest in tonight's event with several hundred registrants. You'll note that the question and answer chat is open, however, so please, throughout the next hour, submit questions for the panelists. My colleague Drew is in the background supporting our technology efforts and will be helping to identify questions for the speakers for the final 15 minutes of tonight's event. This event is being recorded, and we'll send a link to the recording by email later this week. So let's move on to tonight's topic. Now a full year, 2 years into the global pandemic, we're all aware that this historic event has changed the course of the traditional school to career path and has opened up new opportunities. A growing number of emerging adults are looking towards an intentional gap year as an innovative tool they can use to develop their personal identity, boost their skill set, and explore their career path. Research frequently demonstrates the positive benefits of gap years, from improved academic performance in college to gains in confidence and maturity to higher career satisfaction later in life. By definition, a gap year is a semester or year of experiential learning, typically taken after high school and prior to career or post-secondary education, in order to deepen one's practical, professional, and personal awareness. This evening, the panelists will discuss how a meaningful gap year can equip students with the necessary skill for future satisfaction in their life, education, and career, and what we can all do to normalize the gap year option. So with no further ado, joining us tonight, I'd like to introduce our team of panelists. First off, we have Christoph Guttentag, Dean of Undergraduate Admissions at Duke University. A native of the San Francisco Bay Area, Christoph received his undergraduate degree in philosophy and music theory at the University of California at Santa Barbara. He received his master's degree in musicology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he also discovered the field of college admissions. He worked in the Penn admissions office for 9 years in various positions, including regional director, director of staff, and director of planning. In 1992, he moved to North Carolina to become director of undergraduate admissions at Duke. In 2006, he was named dean of undergraduate admissions. Thank you and welcome, Christoph. Next up, we have Jane Sarouhan, accredited gap year consultant. Along with her husband, Jason, she is the J2 behind J2 Guides, a professional gap year consulting service that puts empowerment, expertise, and affordability at the center of the gap year planning process. Jane has been a leader in experiential and gap year education for over 25 years. She's a nationally accredited Gap Year Association consultant and keynote speaker at the USA Gap Fairs. Jane travels the world to vet quality gap opportunities, advises programs on best practices, creates experiential education curriculum and workshops, and helps gap year families curate intentional gap years that fit their unique goals, needs, and budgets. Thank you, Jane, and welcome. Next up, we have Lilly Slaughter, Gap Year alum and founder of the Suwandi Foundation. After high school, Lilly took a gap year living in Bali, Indonesia, teaching English to local students. This experience evolved Lilly's goals and dreams and inspired her in the creation of the Swandi Foundation, whose mission is to use the power of education to help break the cycle of poverty. Lilly is currently a student at Loyola Marymount University studying sociology and peace studies. Lilly hopes that her gap year experience will inspire others to go about life with a purpose and learn about the amazing diversity the world has to offer. Thank you for joining us, Lilly. And finally, we have Sri Kulkarni, Chief of External Affairs with AmeriCorps. Sri brings a variety of experience in service and public affairs to AmeriCorps. This includes 14 years as a Foreign Service Officer with the State Department, where he specialized in public diplomacy and worked in public affairs in international information programs, completing tours in Taiwan, Russia, Iraq, Israel, Jamaica, and Washington, D.C. He also spent time as a Pearson Fellow with the U.S. Senate, advising on foreign policy, defense, and veteran affairs. Sri furthered his experience as a candidate for Congress in 2018 and 2020, running the first U.S. campaign in 27 languages. He holds a bachelor's in linguistics from the University of Texas and a master's in public administration from Harvard Kennedy School. He speaks English, Spanish, Russian, Hindi, Hebrew, and Mandarin Chinese. Lucky for me, our panel tonight is just in English because that's the only one of those languages I speak. So we're absolutely honored and thrilled to have each of you joining us this evening. So let's go ahead and get started. Christoph, I'm going to direct the first question to you. As more and more American colleges and universities are actively encouraging their admitted students to defer admission for an intentional gap year, describe Duke's philosophy on the gap year option and why you decided not just to allow deferrals, but to actually create a scholarship program to help make these opportunities even more accessible.
Carrie, thank you, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to participate. We love our gap year program, and thanks to all of the panelists and to all of the audience who are thinking about this. I took a gap year of sorts between college and graduate school. It's part of the reason why this matters to me. It was absolutely one of the most important years of my life, and I wish I had done it earlier. I wish I'd done it before I'd gone to college. Here's our sense of gap years. We think gap years benefit almost everybody, almost all the time. There's so many benefits to the students, and I will say this: so many students who are going to college now have been working towards that goal for years. And for some of them, it's been on their mind or on their parents' mind for 10, 15, 18 years. So they've had this singular focus. Sometimes their work in secondary school is focused with this particular goal. It's all been geared towards that, and which is great, but it can also be limiting. Students come out of high school sometimes having simply the perspective of their school, the perspective of their goals, the perspective of their peers, the relatively limited perspective of a process with a particular goal in mind. College is so different from high school. The opportunities to explore, the opportunities to engage with people that are different than you, the opportunities to change your mind. There's so many opportunities. Those opportunities are better if a student has taken the time to rest, to not only just to rest and catch their breath, but to explore their values, to be exposed to experiences, cultures, ideas, people different than the ones that they've had. It makes them better college students. It makes them more ready to take advantage of what a college has to offer. Frankly, it makes them more mature. It gives them a broader set of experiences. So from the college's perspective, the student who has taken a gap year is a better member of our community. They know how to handle sometimes challenging circumstances better. So when something happens that isn't exactly what they planned, they're better able to react to it, to respond to it, to take advantage of it, or to just set it aside. They have a year more maturity. They have a broader set of perspectives. So from the college's perspective, the student who has taken a gap year is a better student. This, we've had as high as 10% of our first year students having taken a gap year, and it makes for a better class. It makes for better student experience. It makes them a better classmate. So for all of those reasons, we think it's beneficial, not just for the student, it's beneficial for the institution as well. We were fortunate to receive funding for our gap year program, because one of the unfortunate aspects of gap years is they often they cost money, especially if they're organized programs. There's an expense associated with them. And so sometimes what that means is that the students who can take advantage of them are limited by their financial resources. So for us to have a family that was willing to help students with the cost of a gap year up to $15,000 for the year. I mean, so that makes a difference. That was important to us and important to them, because it meant that not just people that had the sort of resources to take a gap year could do it. Gap years are great experiences for virtually everybody, and the opportunity to make them more broadly available was very important to us. We were thrilled by that. It was very consistent with what our approach. The final thing that I'll say is we are believers that the gap year program that is best is the one that suits the individual student the best. So we like to make resources available to students to help them figure out what gap year program is right for them, or to create their own. And we are happy to leave it up to the student to decide what program or programs or what activity, what experience is right for them in taking a gap year. So I'll stop there.
Wow, Christoph, that's great. You hit on so many key points. I could see Jane's head just nodding, the whole time along. And just as a quick follow-up, what is the deferral process then like? If you have interested students there wanting to attend Duke, they want to do this gap year, is there a formal deferral policy in place?
Yes, and this is one of those things that can be different from school to school. So as in many things with the admissions process, details matter, and you can't assume that the way one school does it, one college does it, is the way that another college will do it. Right? So the way there are two things. One is we actually have a question in our application: are you considering taking a gap year? That's not binding at all, but it just helps us get a sense of what a student is thinking about. Our process is such is that once a student has been admitted, after they have indicated their intent to enroll, that's the point at which they then tell us that they would like to take a gap year. And there's a form that they fill. If they want funding, there's a form that they fill out. They tell us what their plans are, how they would spend the money. There are certain conditions that we place on students taking the gap year, and we make those very clear to them, and they have to explicitly agree to those conditions. One of them is that they're not going to apply to another college, right? If we're going to hold a space for a student, we want that student to commit to enrolling. We want the benefit of that gap year. And we don't want them we don't want them enrolling at another university. We want it to be a different kind of experience. So there are a couple of conditions like that. They have to abide by our community standard. They have to behave. But there's either a form that they fill out or they contact us. We tell them what the conditions are. If they want funding, they apply for the funding. And we generally are able to let them know within about 4 to 6 weeks how that all turns out. We are very much in the habit of approving gap years. I don't remember the last time we told someone that they couldn't take a gap year. And we approve funding for virtually everybody.
Wow, that's wonderful. Thank you, Christoph. My predecessor, Ethan Knight, the former executive director of the Gap Year Association, during my onboarding to my new position here, he had told me, with higher ed, we feel very strongly that they need to be a part of the gap year movement, not a part from. And you really articulated the many benefits so well. Thank you. Next, I'd like to direct the question to you, Jane. As someone who has worked with gap year students for over 2 decades, how have the reasons or benefits of taking gap time changed?
I also, like Christoph, just want to start off by saying thank you so much. And I really want to give a special shout out to Julia Rogers, who I believe is logging in from Colombia right now, who would have loved to have been here with us in person virtually, who I know was a real masterful mind behind tonight's event. And so just wanted to give a big hello to Julia and thank you for including me in this process. You know, I would say the benefits, if I flip them, same. And Christoph nailed it. I mean, the resiliency, the just broadened perspective, the sense of humility, like some of the simplest things, students come home and say, I feel so much more connection with my own family. Sometimes it takes being out of state, out of home for sure, out of country, experiencing other people, other perspectives, other viewpoints to just come back to the simplest core values. And then sure, proficiency in another language, true quality service-based experiences, starting a foundation like Lilly, you know, then things really just go. And that has been the case for 30, 40, 50 years. The gap year is not a brand new thing here in our country. It's still gaining traction, but there have been some of the most notable experiential education providers, including Knowles and Outward Bound, have been out here working really hard for 50 plus years in the United States. So I'd say the benefits are still really true to what we've always seen in this field of experiential education, of learning by doing, of getting out of the four walls of a classroom and putting it into real practice. The reasons, that's the one that I was really having fun thinking about that leading up to tonight's panel, because I do think there's been some shifts. I led my first program in 1994 and took my own first big trip around the world in 1991, 92. So this is my 30-year anniversary from that journey. And I think the word intention has already come up a number of times tonight, and that is so key to this generation of gappers. And frankly, I think there's a synergy between also the gap year movement, because we are leaning into it and saying, we want you to really be intentional about this choice. We want you to really think about why you want it. Is it to address mental and physical health? Huge growing issues we know, and COVID has certainly kind of catapulted that to the top of the list. Academic burnout has only been increasing over the last 30 years, and this intense pressure to get into one's dream college. So I just think the volumes of students who are emerging right now into young adulthood with levels of academic stress and emotional stress is significantly higher than what we saw and what I saw in my earlier years as a field instructor. Students at that time, I think, were really looking for adventure and experience. I don't want to diminish those real intentions. Like Christoph, I too had a life-changing year 30 years ago. So I wasn't just out there kicking it, you know, in a bar in Thailand. I was really earnestly trying to soak up everything I could from my professors and the learning. But there were, I think, again, more of a focus on experience, exploration, maybe even looking for an academic edge in the college process. And certainly there was a much bigger focus on volunteering. So just to fast forward again, 30 years later, I think that this generation is so savvy. And again, this is where we come together as a field and as the young adults. I think service students have a real good grasp now on the nuances of what it means to be a responsible volunteer. So there's so much more dialogue in the last decade alone about ethical volunteering. What is voluntourism, and what is my responsibility as a learner in this environment to be as humble as to what I stand to gain as I could potentially give. So I think there's just a more acute examination. Therefore, frankly, I do have students every year that want to serve, and I love that, but they're coming much more informed around what that looks like. So it's not just, I want to volunteer on my gap year. It's like, I understand this is complicated and I want to make sure I do it right. So I think the volunteer piece, and then again, in addition to the exploration advantage, I think people also understand taking a gap year shouldn't be for an academic edge. I think we've also seen a bit of a swing in the pendulum there. I think students you're on your track academically. Lots of students have beautiful and fabulous kind of portfolios to showcase at 18. This should be a year for you. This should be a year for your own personal academic career growth, but not to try and gain an edge necessarily in the college process. So I think we've seen a shift there. Yeah, I believe, I guess in conclusion of this first question is just that students are really clearly value driven in this investigation. Maybe they need to pause and make money. I think that's a really fabulous and intentional thing. But that idea of, I'm going to take stock and consider why I want to take this time. And if they're not asking it, if they're at all connected to any of us in the field, we are going to ask it and help nurture that. So I'll pause there, but I think lots the same. And if anything, it's just only improved with that level of student engagement and of course the wide range of offerings. But the benefits have been irrefutable for as long as I've been around.
Thank you so much, Jane. I'm going to come back to you here in a little bit and see if we can talk more about some of the different programs, experiences, places that you're often see these students traveling to for their gap year experience. Right. So next up, we have Lily. As a gap year alum, Lily, you spent your gap year teaching in Indonesia, an experience that was meant to only be a short amount of time that ultimately extended into several months. Can you describe what it was about that experience that helped to develop you into the person you are today?
Totally. Again, first off, thank you guys for having me. I feel really honored to be here. I think especially as a gap year alum and current student, this is something that I would tune into to listen to. So it feels really cool to be able to talk to people and share my experience. I think pretty much 99% of my life is talking about my gap year. So it's nice to actually talk about it with a purpose. Like Carrie said, I'm a college student right now, so I'm right in my process of figuring out where my gap year has led me. I spent almost a year teaching English in Bali, Indonesia, and that extended from just my 8-week stay. I got there with one backpack and I was like, I'll be here for 2 months. And really quickly, I realized that my experience there was about a lot more than what I thought it was. I came into the situation, I think, a little bit like what Jane had talked about, not knowing exactly what I was looking for. I hadn't taken that time to figure out what I needed. And when I got there, I had the time alone to sit down and kind of say, what am I doing here? Why am I here? How can I make this experience the best I can? And I just fell in love with the community I was working with and the people. And I really quickly began to realize that this experience was changing my understanding of self, my understanding of the world around me, and really my role in this world. And I think coming back into my life here in college and just as an adult, I think I've learned a lot about who I am and how to make a difference in the world positively. I think what Christoph touched on in the beginning, I came into my college experience feeling more mature, more understanding, more connected than I think a lot of my peers. And that was something I was scared of when I left for my gap year. I was a little scared of feeling left behind, and I have never, ever felt left behind. I feel, if anything, like I've taken a step forward and I can share my stories and really impact people around me. I think on my campus, I've created a community around me that supports what I believe in. I got back to the US and I was like, how can I continue this? How can I continue to do what I did this entire year? And I ended up starting a nonprofit called the Swandi Foundation, and that helps pay for education for the students that I was teaching. So through that experience, I've learned a lot about how to kind of manage nonprofits, how to kind of go about my life and essentially build myself a job for the future. So if I had not taken a gap year, I can't imagine where I would be personally. I think back to when I was in high school and I was like, oh, I'll be a business major. And now I'm a sociology major and I know not much about business, but I think my gap year time really showed me that I needed to find more of myself. And by doing that and by understanding myself better, I think I understand the world a lot better. So I think any student that takes a gap year, I think they get a lot of that out of it. It obviously depends on what you put into it, but when you're able to fully commit and connect, it changes your path and your future. And yeah, I think ultimately I would never change my gap year experience, and I try and tell so many people. I meet with a lot of students. My sister's in high school right now, and she's a senior, so she's graduating. And I've been meeting with a lot of her friends who are all interested in taking gap years, and it really empowers me because I think when I was in high school, I was the only student in my graduating class who took a gap year, and it was scary. And if I had known what Christoph had talked about and even what Jane talked about, I feel like I would have been so much more ready. But It is you have to take that step, and once you take that step, it all flows. Like you go down a river and you make it, and you put work into it and you get so much back from it, and it ultimately makes you just an incredibly better person, I think, in the long run, and more mature, more confident. I can tell you this, I could never sit here and do this in front of people 4 years ago, right before my gap year. I would have like cowered into a corner. So I'm so glad I got that experience, and I'm glad I get to share it with you all.
Wonderful, Lily. Thank you. I know that we've got a lot of students and parents tuning into this panel, and I think just your words of wisdom and the experience that you've had is likely really reassuring to many of them. At what point in your high school career did you decide that you were going to go this route?
I decided right around the beginning of my senior year. I had been looking the year before in my junior year for summer programs. And every program I was like, oh, 2 weeks, that's not really long enough. 3 weeks, maybe. And I kind of worked through that summer doing a couple different little things around the city where I grew up. And when I got into my senior year of high school, I was like, I really wish I had gotten that opportunity to travel, to explore, to figure more out. And the other thing was that I really did not know what I wanted to do, as I think a lot of students are. As you grow up, you have no clue. So to take like literally any amount of time to yourself and figure that out is so important. And that was what my gap year did for me. And I think my beginning of senior year, I sat there and I said, you know what? I actually applied to colleges, and I took a gap year. I deferred from Loyola Marymount for a year, and it was an easy process. And I wish everyone knew how easy it was, because it really is. Like, your school is there to support you, and whether you apply to schools or not, they still aren't going to look down on you for taking a year off.
That's great.
Yeah,
Thank you,
really
Lily. Yeah. I saw a comment come in about what a wonderful testimonial it was, and I agree. So thank you. Let's move on to Sri, representing AmeriCorps. As a former AmeriCorps alumni myself, I was thrilled to have AmeriCorps joining us on this panel. And Sri, there are so many ways for individuals to experience AmeriCorps as a gap year, from trail building in our national parks to mentoring in under-resourced urban schools to supporting innovative nonprofits around the country. In your experience, what do you think the biggest benefits are to national service, and how do they help prepare young people for the workforce of tomorrow?
Well, first of all, Carrie, let me say thank you to the Gap Year Association for hosting this event. And I just want to tell you how thrilled I am to be here with you celebrating Gap Year's 10th anniversary, at least virtually. And I want to start out by saying something a little bit weird. So I've worked in the Senate, I've run for Congress, I've lived and traveled all over the world. But if I'm being honest right now, and I'm speaking specifically to the students out there, if I'm being completely honest, I'm jealous of y'all. Because at this moment, you have the most possibilities in front of you, literally almost limitless directions that you could go from here. And the fact that you're here right now, that you are thinking about choosing to take a gap year, means that you aren't just following the path someone else gave you. You're choosing your own path. And I can tell you, every single person I know who took a gap year was glad that they did. The big question is, what are you going to do with that year? When I was coming out of high school, I had a lot of friends who backpacked around, which is fun, but obviously COVID threw a monkey wrench into that. But I can tell you, having seen the entire world, right now at this moment, I choose to be here at AmeriCorps doing national service. And I think after tonight, a lot of you will too, and I'll tell you why. You see, when I was your age, I used to be really jealous of my mom. Now, y'all know this is Black History Month. You see the background behind me. My mom marched for civil rights in the 60s, when Martin Luther King was alive. She protested against the Vietnam War when she got to college. Back then, young people were active and they were activists. They were part of movements. But a lot of times I felt like my generation didn't have that. And I envied her. Where was my generation's youth movement? Well, it turns out I was just a little bit early, because it's actually your generation that's coming up right now, which is facing the biggest problem that we have seen in a century. The largest pandemic ever in American history, the existential threat of climate change, the most massive protest for racial justice since the 1960s, huge inequalities and gaps in education and economic opportunity, hunger like we've never seen before. Now, we've faced big challenges before, but never so many at one time. And that's not people my age who are going to solve these problems. When I was in high school, I didn't even have email, but your generation can organize, you can innovate, you can solve these problems faster than I could ever dream of. And that's where national service comes in. I'm sure you all know somebody who signed up for the military, for the Army, the Navy, the Marines. But what if you could sign up to serve your country right here? What if instead of signing up to go off to Iraq or Afghanistan, like some of my colleagues did, you could serve in Baltimore, or Oakland, or Texas, or Wisconsin, or Montana, or your own community? What if you could serve your country by signing up to fight climate change and poverty and inequality, by mentoring students who had learning loss this year, by giving vaccinations to people, by doing disaster recovery after a hurricane or winter storm? What if you got an education award that went towards a college degree while getting real-world hands-on experience solving the biggest challenges together? That's what it means to sign up for AmeriCorps. What if you were able to join Public Health AmeriCorps and become one of the next public health leaders in this country? Well, what if you were able to join a climate corps that would change the face of this planet? Yes, this will be good for your resume. Yes, it will be good for college applications and your future career. Yes, you will receive a living allowance if you come to AmeriCorps and a $6,500 scholarship, and more than 250 colleges are going to match that scholarship. And yes, this is more than a service program. It's actually a leadership development program. But the biggest reason that I am jealous of you right now is because you are about to learn more than you ever thought before about yourself. What are you made of? Now, some of you might be ready to go on the website right now and sign up. If you want to start, it's at AmeriCorps.gov, AmeriCorps with an S, .gov. And yes, we have programs in all 50 states and US territories. There's only 75,000 slots for the entire nation. So make sure you get in your application early, and do look for the right opportunity for you. Follow your heart. Find the program that's addressing an issue that you really care about. And for those of you out there who are high school counselors or gap year advisors, please help us spread the word about AmeriCorps and national service. Reach out to us. If you work in admissions, please get in touch with us. We want to talk to you about schools of national service, a way for you to attract more AmeriCorps alums to your campus. And we're going to put that contact information on the side there. And for all of you, once again, I am so envious of you and so grateful to be here with this generation that is literally going to change the world. Now it's your turn to decide. What's at your core?
Wow, Sri. I did AmeriCorps 20 years ago, and you made me want to log out of this right now and go sign up again. Thank you. Thank you. So clearly, during a gap year experience, AmeriCorps is an option. Jane, tell us about, in addition to AmeriCorps, what are some other, programs, experiences, or even locations where you find students are most successful in pursuing their gap year time?
You're going to either love me or hate me for this answer, Carrie, but of course, students will be most successful where they've really examined what's right for them. So let me just briefly say a little bit more about that, and then I'd love to share some more. It's not a cookie cutter process, just like college isn't. And just as you're looking at colleges and the classes and the departments and the professors, your own budget, how close to home, the extracurriculars, the community and traditions, these are the same things we really need to be thinking about when examining a gap year. What is your why is something Jason and I talk about all the time, is starting with that intention piece. Why the gap year? Really understanding your budget as a family, really authentic, transparent conversations as a family. What are we up for? What can we afford? What kind of structure support do we need? Coming back to that mental health piece I suggested earlier, students really need to think about what they need to be successful in a gap year. Lily bit off a huge thing by flying halfway around the world to be in Bali for 8 weeks. And not everyone will thrive in that environment. And I'm sure it didn't come easily all the time. How much support or structure do you need? Do you need to be with peers? Do you need to be able to have telehealth appointments? Who knows what? So again, really making sure before we just jump into like rattling out programs, that families really take into consideration the goals, the intention, the budget, the resources, what you need to be successful. We talk a lot about this stress versus stretch. Jason and I have, again, a long background in experiential education, and inherent in that is this belief of, we want you to push right up against that comfort zone and even go past it. But you should not be treading water for an entire year. You should not be just doing everything you can to survive. That is not the point. So there is a sweet spot there of being stretched just enough, but you're held by either facilitators or curriculum or some familiarities so that you also have time to really lean into that. And I think these success stories that we hear from Lily and Christoph sees campus and that Sri has seen with AmeriCorps graduates or veterans is this sense of, it's usually the adversity that makes us stronger. Yes, the gorgeous vistas and views do worlds to kind of open our eyes and these meaningful, transformative connections with people different from ourselves. But it really is, I think, seeing what we're made of and realizing, oh my gosh, I got through that thing, that tough thing. That means I could probably do that again and again. So there's my little preachy first part of the answer. I think in terms of some really successful experiences, there is a strategy here. There are wonderful year-long programs like AmeriCorps. AmeriCorps is absolutely a beloved referral for us. We have long believed in trying to spotlight and highlight gap year opportunities here in our own country, and COVID gave us a great opportunity to do that. So I think things like that are tremendous. All the infrastructure is there: instructors, leadership, peers, stipends, and even wonderful awards when you complete your AmeriCorps. So huge fan. I think for families and professionals who are here for the first time, going to the Gap Year Association website and starting with the accredited programs, that does start to bring you to those programs that, as Christoph suggested earlier, do have kind of a bit more of a higher price tag. So they aren't for everyone, but I think it gives a really good sense of the caliber and reputability of some programs that are a great kind of Kickstarter for most students' gap years. And many of them are just a semester long, 2 or 3 months, let's say, or let's say 1 to 3 months. So there's a list of almost 20 accredited programs on the Gap Year Association website. I really believe that families should take a look there, because even if they are out of your budget or your interest, many of those people I consider dear colleagues and friends. They've been in the work for decades. It's a great intro. Get your feet wet, get on the phone, attend a live webinar. It doesn't matter. Follow them on social media. There's great storytelling, alumni voices. You just kind of start to see what's out there, and learning what you don't want is absolutely as valuable as learning what you do want in this process, when right now you may feel like I'm the only person in my graduating class. I hear that every day, Lily.
Right.
So
Yeah.
Getting you connected with community and starting with some of those programs. Do you want me to pause there, Carrie?
Oh yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
That was a lot of helpful advice. Thank you, Jane. Yeah.
Sure.
Christoph, I'd like to get back to you with a follow-up question. You talked a lot about, Duke's process and even the funding that's available for students pursuing the gap year option. What advice would you give fellow colleges and universities who may be hesitant to encourage the gap year option to their admitted students?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's an interesting problem. I actually had an employee working in our office whose child wanted to take a gap year at another university, and they wouldn't allow it. And I have to say, it completely mystified me. I mean, I really did not understand why any university would not actively encourage their students to take a gap year. I would say, if a university is for some reason ambivalent about it, I would say look at the research on college completion, look at the research on the contributions that gap year students do, talk with current gap year students. Most colleges have some students who've taken a gap year. And just to extend it a little further, more colleges, this is particularly true of public universities, are starting to pay attention to military veterans as potential members of their community. They're not exactly gap year students, but they're not exactly not, right? I mean, they bring to campus a particular, a unique, interesting, different, valuable set of experiences. And I think, start just by talking to the people that have taken a different path to your institution and ask them, whether that's been beneficial to them, and then ask the people that they know in the institution sort of what members of the community they are. I think there may be some reasons that some colleges have that are managing a very small group of students and worrying about enrollment. One of the advantages, just from a pure enrollment management perspective is that when you have students taking a gap year, you know those students are going to be part of your freshman class. So there's this part of your, there's a part of the freshman class that you don't need to recruit. You don't even need to admit them because you've admitted them the year before. So there are all of these advantages. The final thing that I would say is talk to your colleagues at institutions that have gap years. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? You don't need to reinvent processes. You don't need to reinvent forms. You don't need to reinvent conditions. We've all done this work, and we're happy to share it. I think that this is the final thing that I'll say. We benefit. We as an institution benefit, and we as a society benefit if the number of universities and colleges that encourage gap years grow. If taking a gap year, the more taking a gap year becomes normalized, then that helps us in the long run, and frankly, it helps society as well. So ask us. We're all willing to share, and then ask, of course, the folks at the Gap Year Association.
Great. Thank you, Christoph. I'm seeing lots of questions starting to come in from the audience as well. Sri, you had several just kind of, about the logistics of AmeriCorps and all of that. And I think we've got sent links and kind of followed up with more of the details in terms of living stipends and all of that. So just one last question for you, Sri, and then I'm going to bounce back over to Lily. She's been getting lots of good questions in the chat. So one for you, Sri, we've, in just kind of reflecting back in terms of your professional career and the fact that you've, been a member of the U.S. Foreign Services and spent time in many different countries. If you could put yourself in the shoes of a younger Sri, how do you think a gap year before college would have helped prepare you for your career?
Sure. So, the one thing I can say is that the shoes of a younger Sri didn't know where the older Sri was going to be. And, coming out of high school, I thought I was going to go into law school. I had my whole trajectory planned out in front of me. And then I spent a year in Moscow. Interestingly, the exact same time that this unknown guy named Vladimir Putin came to power. And I saw a conflict going on there, and it completely changed my trajectory. And that's when I applied to the Foreign Service, and I spent 14 years overseas trying to preserve peace and stability around the world. So I literally did not know what my path was going to be. And so I think for those of y'all who are coming out of high school right now, what I would say to you is don't necessarily think, what is this going to do for me 10 years from now, 15 years from now, because you don't know where you're going to be 10 years from now. You may think you're going on to med school or to law school after this. Your entire path may change. And in my case, I had to drop out of school to come home and take care of my dad who was sick with cancer. Your life path, you don't know where it's going to be. But what I will say is this: when you're looking up at the top of that mountain, like Carrie has right behind her, you may think that you can see the top of the mountain, but it's only when you get there that you can actually see the view to where you're going to go beyond that. And so I think that's what I would give advice to all of y'all right now. Pick something that you're really passionate about, go with your heart for this gap year, and you may have opportunities that you never dreamed of before afterwards.
Thank you, Sri. That's great. Lily, we have a question here from the audience for you, asking, how did you get comfortable with the support or lack of support before you headed off to Bali? And kind of related to that, someone also wanted to know how you found that particular experience. How did you decide to head to Indonesia?
Yeah. I actually met Julia Rogers, who connected me with this amazing panel. And Julia lived in my town, and she happened to run gap year programs, and I ended up chatting with her just for a minute. And I was early in my stages of planning a gap year, and I planned all of my gap year by myself. I've always been like an organizer and a planner, so that was definitely in my favor. But just to have people around me that I talked to, I just got advice from Julia. I talked to my parents, I talked to my teachers, my friends, my community. And I found people who had traveled before who said, definitely try and go here, or try not to do that, or like all these different things. So I had a lot of support from my community, from my family, from my friends, my teachers. I think when you're in high school, you have this amazing network of teachers and friends who have experience, especially when you're talking to your teachers. A lot of them have either traveled or explored or done some sort of service. So you can talk to them about what you want to do. And I think as we are evolving into a more gap year friendly society, there's a lot more conversation about it. So it definitely was uncomfortable, but you grow to be comfortable with being uncomfortable when you're in a gap year. Because there's a lot of stuff that pops up, and maybe you have to change your plans. I mean, like I said, I arrived in Bali with a plan to be there for 8 weeks, and I ended up staying for 11 months. So it was not how it was supposed to go. But I think that was kind of my biggest support system, was my friends and family. And then when you get to where you're going, whether it be in the US, whether it be in your community or in another community near you or in another country, you build a network of other gap year students, people who have volunteered there, the staff that volunteer wherever you are or doing whatever you're doing. They all are experiencing the same things as you. So you can build a network and community through that. As far as finding a program, I kind of touched on it in the chat, but for me, one of the biggest things that I think for my gap year, I knew I wanted to travel internationally. So I started picking places where I might want to go. And from there, I narrowed it down to smaller nonprofits there. Rather than going through gigantic companies or other big things, I looked directly at the source. So I knew I wanted to go to Indonesia, and I knew I wanted to do something related to education. So I just started Googling, volunteering in Indonesia, education, volunteering in Indonesia, teaching, like volunteering in Bali. And eventually I found the program that I went through. And it's amazing because through that, I ended up finding a really tiny nonprofit organization. So I think it had a bigger role and impact in the community there and got to make a bigger difference. And there's millions of programs out there. I know like I'm obviously partial to my program, but every gap year student I meet has an amazing experience. I know I just talked to a student who's working with me on my nonprofit, and she did a year in the US working for AmeriCorps last year during COVID, and she loved it. And she found it through doing the same thing, kind of like researching how to make a difference in your community, and ended up doing a whole year doing AmeriCorps. So there's so many different opportunities. It's really just looking for what you're interested in.
Great. Thank you, Lily. Christoph, I'm going to direct this next question to you. We had an anonymous question asking, what does a student have to accomplish during the gap year to increase their chances of getting a positive decision from one of their top choice schools?
Well, that's such a good question. And there are a couple of elements to that. One is it's the exception rather than the rule that one would apply to college during a gap year. Most of the time, especially given the logistics of applying to college, filling out the application, submitting the application, and especially getting transcripts, asking a counselor for recommendations, asking teachers for recommendations, all of that is a lot simpler, and the logistics of it tend to be simpler and more standardized if one is applying to college, and applying to college in your last year of high school, figuring out where you want to go to college, and then taking a gap year. Now, so the other thing is, so the logistics of it are that there are some students who decide, I want to take a gap year, and then decide where I want to go on to college, and they take on the burden, if you will, or the effort of applying to college while they're on a gap year. It might not be the easiest thing to apply to college while you're in Bali, or it depends on if you're in a place where internet service is or is not reliable, how you're feeling about writing your college application essay while you're taking a gap year. There's a lot of uncertainty there. Will you have the time? Will you have the inclination? What other things are going to matter to you? But people do it. People have done it. And I would say that with respect to a gap year and college admissions, it's the same. The principle is the same, regardless of whether you're taking a gap year or not, which is what matters to you? What are you doing about it? Are you making a difference? Why are you doing it? I mean, those are the same questions. There's nothing specific about a gap year that's going to make a particular difference with respect to a college application. A gap year does not intrinsically make you a better applicant. Hopefully it makes you a better you, right? It helps you develop who you are. But I feel like the gap year is there really for personal development, personal growth, personal benefit. And I think that and we've had applicants that apply from gap years, and sometimes it feels as if they've taken the gap year in order to enhance their application, and they often end up being disappointed.
Great, thank you for that answer, Christoph. That was helpful. We had a question come in. As we talked about earlier, 2 years into this global pandemic, and we're not quite, through it yet. There was a question. I'm going to ask Sri and then Jane to kind of elaborate. There's a question that came in terms of whether there's, virtual gap year opportunities. Sri, are there any gap year virtual opportunities through AmeriCorps?
Sure. So obviously we've had to adapt like everybody has during the pandemic. So a lot of the work, there's capacity building type work, for example, that gets done remotely. But having said that, some of the work that we've been doing has been directly related to the pandemic. And so, we have teams of young people actually. There are these NCCC teams, like FEMA Corps teams, for example, who will go wherever they're needed. And so usually, in the past, it has been after a hurricane, after a fire, after the winter storm this past year in Texas. But this past year, we set up mass vaccination sites, and now we've been doing testing as well. And so even during the pandemic, there's actually opportunities for you to get together with other folks and develop those team building skills, those leadership skills that you might not have otherwise. For example, the Peace Corps, we had a lot of people overseas who had to come back during the pandemic, and we put them into AmeriCorps programs right here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And we're just nearing the end of our time. So Jane, is there any others? We had, maybe any other virtual experiences, and we also had a couple of questions come in for folks that were inquiring about what are the other options for programs that if we don't quite have the resources, to pay. So are there any other, in addition to AmeriCorps that provides a stipend, any other opportunities for programs for students to be working their way through?
Yeah, briefly, many programs pivoted to open up virtual programming, and just as they did bring programming into the United States from typically overseas destinations. And I think, and we hope that many of them will remain. I think Global Citizen Year, based out in San Francisco, typically with internationally based programs, did a great job of pivoting to a virtual based kind of academy, life skills, but still cultural immersion. There are many ways that the virtual experience can still and does still greatly support communities all over our country and the world. Language schools, which there are just tens of thousands of language schools worldwide. If you can't go in person, you could still support those small local schools in Cusco, Peru, and have a one-on-one with a teacher. So language schools, internships, nonprofit management, all kinds of ways to still be very much involved and engaged virtually. I think that will remain. Low cost options. I mean, I think AmeriCorps is really one of the best out there because it's the full deal. It is again that support and structure and peers and mentors and real work, real vetted work. But as an example, a lot of students will dovetail together opportunities through something like WOOF or Workaway or HelpX. We don't generally suggest students plan an entire year around that, but they're all kinds of au pairing, very similar, all kinds of wonderful opportunities, very low cost, where in exchange for your labor, you receive room and board in most cases. And these can be great for the budget, but also some of the most powerful, culturally immersive or other experiences or exchanges that can happen. Another favorite locally here in the States is a small organization called All Hearts and Hands, sort of like a Habitat for Humanity, but they also do provide housing for volunteers and meals. And there's a great sense of community there. These kinds of experiences are not gap specific. So you could be an 18-year-old and rooming and bunking with an 80-year-old. Or a 50-year-old. And if that's great, I think the multi-generational component of a gap year is profound. But again, know what you need and what you want at each point. Carrie, if I can say one more thing about budgeting, because I saw a few questions come up, and I think it came up earlier. I heard some, I didn't remember what the question was, but all of these things we're talking about is not finite to the gap year. These are lifelong skills that students are developing. And so the gap year becomes like, maybe it was something Lily said, is you just pull at the thread, so you start to put it out there. And I always tell students, you'll find some naysayers out there. So maybe leave them to the side and keep tracking the people that are listening to you and are enthusiastic and exciting, and keep pulling at those threads. It's networking. That's what we're talking about. And one of the first things I tell students to do is this kind of resource mapping exercise. Who do you know? Where do they live? What do they do? I have an uncle in the film business in LA. Fancy that. I'm actually interested in film. Or my older brother is doing a study abroad right now in Spain. Maybe I can kind of sleep on an extra room or on a couch. So, just starting with your own network, this is how the best things in life will happen for you, academically, professionally, friendships, partners, the passions that you have. So rather than getting so locked in with some of those dollar signs, again, it's both budget friendly and also it's going to bring the greatest content. So starting to assess what you have with your resources beyond the capital, beyond the money and the dollar sign, and just who's in your family network. And that might really lead to some extraordinary opportunities that you can't even imagine and you couldn't really even pay for.
That's great final advice, Jane. Thank you. Thank you for closing us out with that information. Gosh, we are at the end of our hour together. I saw a comment come in that said this was unexpectedly inspiring, and I have to agree. I'm so incredibly grateful to all of our panelists this evening, and I just want to give an extra special thanks to them. Thank you to all of you who are viewing tonight, who asked such thoughtful questions. Jane already gave a shout out to our colleague, board member, and also an accredited gap year consultant, Julia Rogers with En Route Consulting, who really was the orchestrator of tonight's event. So thank you, Julia. Once we close out the webinar tonight, you'll be prompted to take a quick 5-question survey. We'd love to hear your feedback and thoughts. And in terms of action steps moving forward, I want to encourage you to continue the conversation, within your families, within your workplace. Please take time to visit the Gap Year Association website, where you'll find a treasure trove of information. There's a lot to digest on our website. So I'm going to point you in the direction of 3 particular areas. We have a whole section for resources on planning gap years. We have a page devoted to working with gap year consultants. So Jane represents just one of several accredited consultants who are able to work with their students and families in terms of planning their gap time. And finally, we have a program provider page on our website where you can search for the gap year programs based upon your own personal interests and activities you'd like to pursue, the geographic regions you'd like to visit. So again, thank you for your interest, your involvement, and the role that you play in helping to advance the gap year movement. Whether you're a student, a parent, a high school guidance counselor, or a college administrator, our hope is that you've come away tonight feeling confident that taking an intentional gap year is a worthwhile and meaningful way to spend time before pursuing higher ed or a traditional career path. So with that, we're going to close out tonight's session, but we look forward to connecting with you all again in the future. So thank you so much. Have a good evening.